Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Thanksgiving had always been a grand affair in our family, filled with perfectly roasted turkey, side dishes that took all day to prepare, and conversations that I often wished I could avoid. Jessica, my older sister, had made it her life's mission to remind me of every single failure I had ever experienced, and this year, I had no doubt she would continue the tradition. The house was warm with the scent of cinnamon and butter, the golden lights reflecting off the expensive china Jessica insisted on using, and the air thick with the kind of tension only family gatherings could create. I sat at the far end of the table, swirling the wine in my glass, trying to fade into the background while my parents boasted about Jessica's perfect life, her successful career, her beautiful home, and, of course, her charming husband, Mark. Jessica, perched at the head of the table like a queen holding court, was already on her second glass of wine, a smug smile curling at her lips. She was waiting for her moment, the one where she would take aim and fire, and I knew I was the target. She turned to me, her voice dripping with feigned concern, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still single at your age?" "Embarrassing," she said, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction as she leaned back, watching the words land. Laughter erupted around the table, my father chuckling into his drink, my mother shaking her head with a smile, as if my perpetual singleness was nothing more than an amusing quirk. I forced a tight-lipped smile, gripping my wineglass a little harder than necessary, willing myself to stay calm. I had been through this routine before, endured the yearly humiliation like clockwork, nodding along as Jessica paraded her perfect life in front of me, but this time, something was different. There was a sharpness to her words, an extra bite that made the humiliation burn a little deeper, and I knew she was enjoying every second of it. I could feel the heat rising in my face, but before I could respond, the sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the laughter, silencing the table. Every head turned toward the front door, the moment hanging thick in the air as Jessica's husband, Mark, stood up to answer it. I knew who was on the other side before he even reached for the doorknob, and as soon as the door swung open, I saw her, Emily, my best friend since college, standing in the entryway like she owned the place, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure, her dark hair cascading in perfect waves over her shoulders. But it wasn't her dress that caught everyone's attention. It wasn't even the way she carried herself with the kind of effortless confidence that made people stare. It was the diamond ring on her left hand, catching the light as she lifted her hand, flashing it like a trophy. The room went still, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, my father cleared his throat, and Jessica's face shifted from smug satisfaction to something closer to confusion. Emily smiled, stepping forward as if she had all the time in the world, her eyes locking onto Jessica's as she delivered the blow with the precision of a seasoned assassin. "Funny," she said, her voice light, almost amused, "since your husband proposed to me last night." The words crashed over the room like a tidal wave, sucking the oxygen from the air. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she needed to hold on to something solid. Mark, who had been frozen in place, looked like a man who had just stepped in front of a moving train, his eyes darting between Jessica and Emily as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mother inhaled sharply, my father sat back in his chair, and the rest of the family, who just moments ago had been laughing at my expense, were now silent, their expressions ranging from shock to morbid curiosity. Jessica blinked, shaking her head as if trying to clear a fog, and then she did something that made the moment even more surreal. She laughed. A sharp, hollow sound that carried through the room like a bad joke no one understood. "You're joking," she said, forcing out another laugh, her eyes scanning Emily's face for some sign of deception. But Emily didn't flinch, didn't waver. She simply tilted her head, the smile never leaving her lips. "Oh, I wish I was," she said, her tone almost playful, as if she were enjoying the slow realization dawning on Jessica's face. Mark finally moved, running a hand over his face as if he could wipe away the reality of the situation, But it was too late. The damage was done. The air was crackling with tension, every person at the table waiting for someone, anyone, to say something, to break the unbearable silence that had settled over the room. Jessica's gaze flickered to Mark, her expression demanding an explanation, but all she got in return was a pitiful silence, his throat working like he was struggling to form words that refused to come. I watched, barely able to contain the satisfaction curling in my chest. For years, Jessica had made me the punchline, had treated my life like it was some tragic joke, and now, in the most poetic of twists, it was her turn to be humiliated in front of everyone. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the moment stretch, savoring every second of it. Because this wasn't just some random act of karma. No, this was something else entirely. This was revenge. And it was only just beginning. For a long, painful second, the room remained frozen in time, the weight of Emily's words hanging over the Thanksgiving table like an impending disaster no one knew how to stop. Jessica, whose face had gone through a series of rapid changes, confusion, shock, disbelief, suddenly burst into laughter, the sound sharp and brittle, like glass cracking under too much pressure. "Oh, that's a good one," she said, shaking her head, her voice a little too loud, a little too forced, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor her back to reality. "Very funny, Emily, really. What is this? Some kind of weird joke." But Emily didn't laugh, didn't blink, didn't even shift her weight, just stood there in that ridiculous, breathtaking black dress, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted slightly, the diamond ring on her finger still catching the warm light of the chandelier. "You think I'm joking?" she asked, her tone light, almost amused, as if Jessica's denial was nothing more than an inevitable inconvenience she had anticipated. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering whether she should prolong the agony or cut straight to the part where everything came crashing down. Mark, who had been standing rigidly beside the table, his face now devoid of any color, let out a strained laugh that barely passed as human. "Jess, baby, don't listen to her," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between his wife and the woman who had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of their family dinner. "She's trying to mess with you, that's all." His voice cracked, his throat working as if the weight of his own lies was pressing against his windpipe, choking the words before they could fully form. But Emily, ever the performer, reached into the tiny black clutch she had brought with her, pulled out her phone with practiced ease, and held it up for the room to see. With one swift motion, she tapped the screen, and suddenly, Mark's voice filled the suffocating silence, crackling through the tiny speaker like a death sentence. "I love you, Emily. I can't do this with Jessica anymore. Let's run away together." The words were unmistakable, his voice drenched in desperation, in pleading, in the kind of certainty that could only come from someone who truly believed in what they were saying at the time. The room seemed to close in on itself, the elegant dining table and candlelit centerpiece now nothing more than a stage for an unraveling marriage and an audience too stunned to react. Jessica, whose laughter had died a violent death the moment she heard the voicemail, stood completely still, her entire body wound so tightly it looked like she might snap in half. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breath came out in short, shallow bursts, and then, without warning, she lunged. The chair she had been sitting in scraped loudly against the floor as she shot forward, her nails flashing like claws, aiming straight for Emily's perfect, smug little face. "You lying, disgusting," the words barely escaped before Emily sidestepped the attack effortlessly, a practiced move, as if she had expected Jessica to lash out, had been waiting for it, had been hoping for it. Jessica stumbled forward, her momentum nearly sending her crashing into the table, but before she could recover, a sharp gasp rang out across the room. Their mother, her delicate hands clutching at the pearls around her neck as if the necklace alone could protect her from the absolute disgrace playing out before her eyes, let out a strangled, horrified noise. "Jessica, control yourself," she said, her voice teetering somewhere between shock and disappointment, as though Jessica's physical outburst was the most offensive thing about this situation. rather than the fact that her husband had just been exposed as a cheating liar in front of their entire family. Their father, who had been uncharacteristically silent up until this point, slammed his hand against the table so hard that the silverware jumped. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos, demanding attention in a way only a father's fury could. His sharp eyes landed on Mark first, his jaw tight, his nostrils flaring with something close to disgust. "Is this true?" he demanded, though the question itself was already useless, the evidence damning enough that denial would only make Mark look more pathetic. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it, his face drenched in sweat, his hands twitching at his sides like he wanted to run but knew there was nowhere left to go. His lips moved, struggling to form words that might somehow erase the damage, but nothing came out, just an awful, suffocating silence that stretched on for too long. Natalie, who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire scene, casually lifted her wine glass to her lips and took a slow sip, her expression unreadable. Unlike the rest of the room, she was neither shocked nor horrified. She had known. She had suspected it for months, long before Emily had drunkenly confessed one night, long before the text messages had been discovered, long before she had decided to let this entire thing play out in the most spectacular, gut-wrenching way possible. This wasn't just a dinner gone wrong. This was revenge, methodically planned and executed to perfection. Jessica finally turned, her eyes burning as they landed on Natalie. She was searching for something, maybe an ally, maybe an explanation, maybe even a way out of this, but Natalie simply raised an eyebrow, offering nothing but cold amusement. Mark, his desperation reaching its breaking point, finally snapped his head toward Natalie, his voice hoarse with panic. "You believe me, right?" he asked, his eyes pleading, his hands gesturing wildly as if she was his last remaining lifeline. The entire room held its breath. Natalie tilted her head, swirled the wine in her glass, and let the moment stretch. And then, ever so slowly, she smiled. Mark's desperate plea hung in the air like a dying echo, his voice cracking under the weight of the silence that followed. Every eye in the room had turned to me, waiting for my answer, watching to see if I would extend a lifeline or twist the knife even deeper. I could feel the tension thickening around us, stretching the moment into something unbearable, but I wasn't in any hurry to break it. Instead, I took my time, swirling the last of my wine in my glass, pretending to consider his question as if the answer weren't already obvious. "I don't know, Mark," I finally said, my voice smooth and deliberate, each word sliding from my lips like honey laced with venom. "You always said you loved my sister." His face fell so quickly, it was almost pathetic to watch. His mouth opened, then shut, his throat bobbing as he struggled to swallow the response that had probably formed on reflex. He had expected me to save him, to smooth things over, to shield him from the full force of Jessica's wrath, but that had never been my plan. Not tonight. Not ever. Jessica, who had been standing motionless, looking as though her body had forgotten how to function, finally sucked in a sharp breath. Her eyes were wild, red-rimmed, and shining with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice came out in a jagged whisper, raw and uneven. "So, what?" She choked out, looking between Mark and Emily, her hands trembling at her sides. "That's it? You've just been sneaking around behind my back like a couple of disgusting liars." Mark flinched, his entire body recoiling as if her words had physically struck him, but instead of owning up to what he had done, instead of showing even an ounce of genuine remorse, he did what men like him always did. He tried to rewrite the narrative in real time. "Jessica, listen," he said, his voice low and coaxing, his hands raised in a pitiful attempt to calm her down, as if this entire situation could be soothed away with a few well-placed words. "You know things between us haven't been great lately. I've been trying, but you've been so distant, so cold, and you have got to be kidding me," Emily interjected, her voice cutting through his pathetic excuse like a blade. With the same effortless confidence she had carried from the moment she walked through the door, she reached for her phone again, tapping the screen with practiced ease before lifting it toward the center of the table. "You mean distant like this?" The screen lit up, revealing a string of text messages, the soft glow casting cruel shadows across Mark's now thoroughly ruined expression. Jessica stepped forward, hesitant but unable to resist the pull of curiosity, her breath hitching as she read. I can't stand her anymore. She nags about everything. I just want to be with you. She's so exhausting. I wish I had met you first. Jessica let out a sharp, broken sound, something between a laugh and a sob, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. So it wasn't just a mistake, she whispered, her voice hollow, barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. You really meant it. Every disgusting word. Mark's face twisted, 1,000 lies scrambling to make their way to his lips, but before he could attempt another pathetic excuse, our mother let out an exasperated sigh, shaking her head as if she had just about had enough of the entire scene. Well, Jessica, she said, her voice clipped and tired, her expression unreadable, maybe if you weren't such a terrible wife, he wouldn't have cheated. The room went completely still, the weight of her words slamming into the moment like a train derailing off the tracks. Every muscle in Jessica's body locked into place, her breath catching in her throat as if she had just been struck across the face. I shouldn't have been surprised. I shouldn't have been shocked to hear my mother say something so profoundly cruel, so violently dismissive of the humiliation her own daughter was experiencing, but even I felt the sting of it. Jessica, for all her faults, had spent her entire life striving for perfection, for validation, for the kind of approval that she never truly received from our parents. And now, in the moment when she needed them the most, when she was at her absolute lowest, they had chosen to side with the man who had betrayed her. Jessica's lips trembled, her entire body vibrating with suppressed rage and unspeakable hurt, but before she could say anything, before she could process the full depth of the wound that had just been carved into her, my father spoke. She's right, he muttered, running a hand down his face, already looking exhausted by the whole ordeal. You've always been so controlling, Jessica. Maybe Mark just wanted someone who didn't make him feel like he was walking on eggshells all the time. And just like that, the shift was complete. The betrayal settled over her in real time, her shoulders slumping as she realized that no one in this room was going to fight for her, no one was going to defend her, no one was going to say the words she so desperately needed to hear. Her husband had humiliated her, her best friend had orchestrated her downfall, and now her own family had decided she wasn't even worth their sympathy. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so that only she could hear me. Maybe now, I murmured, watching her carefully, you know what it feels like to be humiliated in front of everyone. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening slightly as the realization set in. This wasn't just about an affair. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was me. This was revenge. And I had just one. But even as she stood there, shaking, something dark flickered across her expression, something dangerous, something that made my stomach twist slightly in anticipation. Jessica wasn't done. Not yet. The night should have ended there, with Jessica defeated, her perfect life crumbling around her, but instead, she disappeared down the hallway, her heels clicking furiously against the hardwood floors. Her breath coming in sharp bursts as she muttered something under her breath that none of us could quite catch. The dining room sat in a stunned silence, my mother's pearl necklace still clutched in her trembling fingers, my father rubbing his temples as though he were already trying to erase this evening from his memory, and Mark standing stiff and useless, his face blank, as if shutting down was his only way of coping. Emily, always composed, always in control, smirked into the rim of her wineglass, the ruby-red liquid swirling in the dim light, her satisfaction practically radiating off of her in waves. She had gotten what she came for, public humiliation served on a silver platter, Jessica stripped of her smug superiority, exposed as just another woman whose husband had betrayed her. But I knew Jessica, knew that she would never let herself be the punchline of someone else's joke, knew that she would sooner set the entire world on fire than sit in the ashes of her own downfall. And I was right. Jessica stormed back into the room, her breath uneven, her eyes gleaming with something wild, something unhinged, something that made my stomach twist with the kind of anticipation you feel just before a storm hits. In her hands, she held a sleek black laptop, her fingers curled so tightly around the edges that her knuckles had turned white, and I knew, before she even said a word, that she had found something. "Oh, you think you won, Natalie?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely contained rage, a manic little laugh bubbling up from her throat as she moved to the center of the room. "Let's see what everyone thinks of you after this." My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't let my face betray even a flicker of concern as she flipped open the screen and turned it toward the rest of the room, the soft blue glow illuminating her expression, satisfaction, vengeance, a dangerous kind of glee. She tapped the keyboard, pulled up a video file, and with one last triumphant glance in my direction, she pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static, the grainy security footage struggling to load, but then the image sharpened, and there it was, the last time I had been at her house, standing in the dimly lit foyer, my hair falling over my shoulder as I leaned in, my lips pressing against Mark's in a kiss that was anything but accidental. A collective gasp echoed through the room, my mother's hand flying to her mouth, my father's chair scraping loudly against the floor as he shot up, his face contorted with disbelief. Mark's expression twisted into something unreadable, his fingers flexing at his sides, and Emily, oh, Emily, her grip on her wineglass tightened, her knuckles blanching, her entire body going rigid as she processed what she was seeing. Jessica's lips curled, her smirk dripping with triumph as she scanned the room, watching the tide shift in her favor, watching the judgment begin to turn on me. "Looks like you're not so innocent after all," she purred, her voice sickeningly sweet, her eyes locking onto mine, waiting for the reaction she was certain would come. I exhaled slowly, let the silence stretch, let the moment drag, let the weight of the accusation settle into the air before I leaned back in my chair, crossed one leg over the other, and started laughing. It wasn't a forced laugh, wasn't nervous, wasn't panicked, it was genuine, deep and full, the kind of laugh that makes people uncomfortable because they don't understand what's funny, don't know if they've lost control of the situation, don't know if they should be afraid. Jessica's smirk faltered slightly, confusion flickering across her face as she watched me, her fingers tightening around the edges of the laptop as if gripping it harder would somehow make it more damning. "Yeah," I said, wiping at an imaginary tear, my laughter fading into something softer, something amused. "And?" The room tensed. My mother's mouth opened, then closed, her perfectly groomed brows knitting together as she struggled to reconcile my complete lack of shame with the supposed scandal of the footage. My father's face darkened, his fingers twitching like he was ready to explode, but I wasn't finished yet. "Unlike you," I continued, my voice steady, my gaze locked onto Jessica's, "I never claimed to be perfect." Jessica blinked, clearly thrown off by the lack of resistance, her plan unraveling before her eyes. She had expected panic, denial, maybe even tears. She had expected to humiliate me the way I had humiliated her. But she had miscalculated. The final nail in her coffin came when Emily, who had been silent up until this point, let out a sharp, humorless chuckle and shook her head. "Oh, Jess," she sighed, swirling the wine in her glass before setting it down with a soft clink. "You really thought this would work, didn't you?" Jessica stiffened, her eyes snapping to Emily, confusion twisting into frustration. "She kissed your boyfriend," she snapped, her voice rising, desperate now, frantic. "She betrayed you, just like Mark betrayed me." Emily tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk that was somehow even sharper than mine. "Maybe," she said, dragging the word out, her voice laced with amusement, but I already knew. Jessica reeled back, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for a response, as she realized, too late, that this wasn't the revelation she had hoped it would be. Because the truth was, I had only kissed Mark for one reason, to plant the seed of doubt, to make sure Emily felt enough rage, enough jealousy, enough bitterness to go through with exposing him. I had never slept with him, had never actually wanted him, had never betrayed Emily, but I had let her believe I had, just for a little while, just long enough to push everything over the edge. Jessica's breath hitched, her fingers curling into fists at her sides, and for the first time all night, she had nothing left to say. The room shifted, the weight of judgment lifting off of me and settling firmly back onto her shoulders. My mother sighed, shaking her head. "Jessica, honestly," she muttered, exasperated. "Did you really need to air out more family drama?" My father ran a hand over his face, already done with the conversation. "This is getting ridiculous," he grumbled, pushing his chair back. "Maybe we should all just call it a night." And just like that, the tables turned once again, Jessica's own plan backfiring in spectacular fashion. She had come back for revenge. Instead, she had only managed to dig her own grave. Jessica stood in the wreckage of her own life, her hands limp at her sides, her face frozen in an expression that no longer held anger, only the hollow remains of something far worse, defeat. The world she had built so carefully, brick by brick, with perfectly curated illusions of success and happiness, had collapsed right in front of her, and she had no one left to cling to, no one left to believe in her, no one left to blame except herself. Her husband had been exposed as a liar and a cheat, her best friend had humiliated her in front of her entire family, and worst of all, the sister she had spent years looking down on had orchestrated every last moment of her downfall. For a long, agonizing moment, she simply stood there, her chest rising and falling in uneven, ragged breaths, her fingers curling and uncurling as if she were struggling to decide whether to scream, cry, or collapse onto the floor. The dining room, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and unfamiliar, the remnants of a Thanksgiving dinner that would never be forgotten scattered across the table in front of her. Plates sat untouched, the golden candlelight flickering against half-empty wine glasses, the smell of roasted turkey and cranberry sauce now sickening rather than comforting. I leaned back in my chair, tilting my head slightly, watching her with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years, savoring the sight of Jessica finally realizing that she was not untouchable, that her cruelty had not been forgotten, that the world she had so carefully built had been nothing more than a house of cards waiting for the right gust of wind to knock it all down. I took my time, letting the silence stretch, letting her absorb every second of her own failure before I finally spoke. "Happy Thanksgiving, sis," I said, my voice soft but laced with unmistakable triumph. "Hope you finally learned some humility." Her breath hitched, her lips trembling as though she wanted to say something, but there was nothing left for her to argue, no defense she could offer, no excuse that could erase the reality of what had just happened. The Jessica that had once commanded every room she walked into, the Jessica that had thrived on belittling others, the Jessica that had spent her life making me feel small, was gone. In her place stood someone I barely recognized, someone stripped raw, exposed, fragile in a way I had never seen before. Mark, who had been uncomfortably silent ever since Jessica's plan had backfired, shifted on his feet, running a hand through his hair as if trying to collect himself. His eyes darted toward Emily, desperate, hopeful, still clinging to the fantasy that she had been telling him the truth, that they could run away together, that this humiliation could somehow still end in his favor. "Come on, Em," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Let's just get out of here. We don't need to be part of this mess anymore." Emily turned to him slowly, her lips curling into a smirk that held nothing but pure, unfiltered amusement. "Oh, Mark," she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice dripping with condescension. "You actually thought I wanted to be with you?" The color drained from his face, his jaw tightening as he took an instinctive step back, blinking as though he had just been slapped across the face. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling tension that still lingered in the air. She let out a small, amused breath, crossing her arms over her chest as she took in the sheer devastation painted across his expression. "I just wanted to see Jessica suffer," she admitted, shrugging like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Did you really think I'd throw away my life for some sad little affair with a man who can't even keep his lies straight?" Mark opened his mouth, then shut it, the last shreds of whatever pathetic dignity he had left crumbling in real time. He turned slightly, as if expecting anyone, to come to his defense, but no one spoke. Jessica wasn't looking at him. My parents had long since checked out of the disaster unfolding in front of them, and I was simply enjoying the show. His hands twitched at his sides, his breath uneven, his entire body sinking under the weight of the realization that he was well and truly alone. His wife despised him, his mistress had never wanted him, and whatever life he thought he was running toward had just been ripped away before it even had a chance to begin. With nothing left to fight for, he let out a slow, shaky breath and sank back into his chair, his head dropping into his hands as he finally gave up. I turned to Emily, my own smirk mirroring hers, the two of us standing side by side, victorious in a way that felt almost too good to be real. Without another word, without so much as a glance back at the destruction we had left in our wake, we turned toward the door, the cool night air waiting just beyond the threshold, the crisp scent of autumn replacing the suffocating staleness of the dining room. As I reached for my coat, my fingers brushing against the soft fabric, I heard Jessica's voice, small and broken, trembling in a way I had never heard before. "You ruined my life," she whispered, the words barely more than a breath, but still I heard them. I paused for just a moment, my fingers tightening around the coat, before I turned back to face her one last time. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice calm, even unshaken by the weight of what had just transpired. "No, Jess," I said, my lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. "You did that all by yourself." And with that, I walked out the door, stepping into the cold November night, leaving behind the broken pieces of my sister's perfect little world. And that, dear viewers, is how you serve revenge, Thanksgiving style.